Ayomide Gabriel, a resilient black woman living in Seoul, stands in the shadows of a lavish engagement party for the city's most feared Mafia boss, Baek Hyun-Ro. While the elite celebrate, Ayomide overhears a chilling secret. Hyun-Ro's own fiance and his head of security are counting down the seconds until he drinks a lethal neurotoxin. With no time to explain and no one to trust, Ayomide does the unthinkable. She storms the stage and slaps the Mafia boss across the face in front of the world's cameras, shattering the poison glass. But her heroism is met with cold fury. Hyun-Ro orders his men to seize her, dragging her to a private interrogation room to pay for the ultimate humiliation. Hi, Islanders. Welcome to Korean Mafia Chronicles. Before we dive into this web of betrayal, smash that subscribe button, like this video, and tell me in the comments, would you risk your life to save an enemy? This story is about to get intense. Now, let's get into the story. Ayomide heard it clearly through the velvet curtains. The neurotoxin is odorless. A woman whispered. It was Min-ah, the bride-to-be, her voice cold as ice. He'll be dead before the final firework hits the sky. And the inheritance? A deep, gravelly voice asked. It was Park, the head of security, already signed. Once he collapses, I take control of the enforcers, and you take the state. Ayomide's blood turned to ice. She pressed her back against the cold marble wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had come here just to find a way out of her own secrets, but now she was holding the life of a monster in her hands. The toast is in 5 minutes. Minna laughed, a sound, sharp and cruel. I can't wait to stop pretending I love that arrogant bastard. Ayomide's hands shook. She should run. She should slip out the back and forget she ever heard their names. But as she looked through the gap in the curtains, she saw Baek Hyun-Ro raising the gold-rimmed flute to his lips. He looked invincible, unaware that his world was about to end. She didn't think. She shoved through the wall of socialites, her heels clicking like gunfire against the floor. Faces blurred, shocked, judgmental, confused. Hyun-Ro's dark eyes met hers for a fleeting second, sharp and questioning, just as she reached the dais. Crack! The sound of her palm meeting his cheek echoed louder than the music. The room exploded into chaos. The champagne glass slipped from Hyun-Ro's hand, shattering against the floor, the poison liquid seeping into the white carpet like a spreading stain. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes. Someone screamed. Ayomide stood her ground, her hand still stinging, her eyes locked onto his. For one impossible moment, the entire world held its breath. Then, Hyun-Ro's hand wrapped around her wrist like a vice. His face was a mask of deathly calm, his eyes burning with dark, terrifying intensity. Seize her, he said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a serrated blade. Before Ayomide could scream, before she could utter a word about the poison, massive hands yanked her backward. Wait, she gasped, her voice catching in her throat as the room spun. Please, I can explain. Get her out of here, Hyun-Ro commanded, never breaking eye contact. Take her to the interrogation room. I'll deal with her myself. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the windowless room. The air in here was different from the ballroom. It was cold, smelling of ozone and expensive leather, stripped of the jasmine perfume and celebratory laughter that had filled the air moments ago. Ayomide was shoved into a hard wooden chair. Her wrists throbbed where the bodyguard had gripped her, but she kept her back straight, her chin tilted upward despite the terror clawing at her throat. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, the rhythmic click of polished shoes approached. Baek Hyun-Ro stepped into the pool of light, his presence filling the small room until the walls felt like they were closing in. He had removed his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt stark against the shadows, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked carved from granite. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like an executioner. He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. The red mark of her palm was still visible on his pale cheek, a vibrant reminder of his public disgrace. Do you have any idea what happens to people who touch me without permission? His voice was a low, dangerous purr that made the hair on her arms stand up. In front of my elders? In front of the press? You didn't just slap a man. Ayomide Gabriel. You slapped the face of the Beck Syndicate. Ayomide swallowed hard, her voice coming out as a dry whisper. I didn't do it to humiliate you. Then why? He slammed his hand on the table, the force making her jump. Was it money? Did a rival family pay a waitress to ruin my reputation? Or are you just another obsessed girl looking for a moment of fame at my expense? I'm not a girl, and I'm certainly not obsessed, she snapped, her Nigerian-American grit flickering through the fear. I was trying to stop you from becoming a corpse. If I hadn't hit you, that glass would have reached your lips. You'd be on that ballroom floor right now, and your loyal guests would be watching you turn blue. Hyun-Ro's eyes narrowed, dark pools of skepticism. Poison? That is the oldest, most pathetic excuse in the book. My security sweeps every bottle. My fiancée herself poured that glass. Exactly. Ayomide countered, leaning forward into space, mirroring his intensity. She didn't sweep it. She seeded it. I heard her, Hyun-Ro, behind the velvet curtain in the West Wing. She wasn't alone. She was with Park, your head of security. They weren't talking about a wedding. They were talking about a funeral. Yours. The room went deathly still. She saw the flicker in his eyes, not belief, not yet, but a crack in his absolute certainty. He straightened up, pacing the small room like a caged panther. Park has been with my family for 20 years, he said, though he seemed to be talking to himself. That he's had 20 years to grow resentful, Ayomide challenged. Check the glass. Check the white carpet where it spilled. If I'm lying, do whatever you want with me. But if I'm right, then the people you're about to let into your bed and your inner circle are the ones holding the knife. Hyun-Ro stopped pacing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the resolve in her curly hair and the steady set of her shoulders. He reached out, his thumb grazing the jawline he had just threatened to break. If you are lying to me, Ayomide, the warehouse will feel like a playground compared to what comes next. I know, she whispered. That's why I'm not lying. Hyun-Ro stood by the door, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the sterile light of the interrogation room. He didn't look back at Ayomide as he signaled to a man waiting in the hallway, a technician carrying a specialized chemical analysis kit. If you are playing a game, Hyun-Ro murmured, his voice like the scrape of steel on stone, it will be the last one you ever participate in. Ayomide watched in tense silence as the technician knelt by a section of the expensive white carpet that had been cut out from the ballroom floor and brought into the room. It was soaked with the champagne she had forced him to drop. The technician worked with surgical precision, extracting a sample of the liquid and applying it to a series of reactive strips. Ayomide could feel her own pulse drumming in her ears, a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking clock on the wall. She knew what she had heard. But in this world of shadows and deception, the truth was often the first thing to be buried. The technician's brow furrowed as the first strip turned a violent, bruised purple. He moved to the second test, his movements becoming more hurried, more urgent. After several grueling minutes, he looked up at Hyun-Ro, his face pale. Sir, the man whispered, his voice trembling. It's a concentrated dose of tetrodotoxin D. It's synthesized to act within minutes of ingestion. It mimics a massive cardiac arrest. It's undetectable in a standard autopsy. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Hyun-Ro didn't move, but the atmosphere around him shifted from cold suspicion to a terrifying, suppressed rage. He looked down at the ruined carpet, then slowly turned his gaze toward Ayomide. The red slap mark on his face had begun to fade into a dull bruise, but his eyes were now burning with intensity she hadn't seen before. Tetrodotoxin, Hyun-Ro repeated, the word sounding like a curse. The specific poison used by the shadow cells in the southern districts. My security team is supposed to have the antidote on hand at all times. They told me the supply was intercepted last month. Because they didn't want you to have an out, Ayomide said, her voice finally finding its strength. They weren't just planning to kill you. They were making sure there was no way to save you. Hyun-Ro stepped toward her, stopping only when his knees brushed against hers. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before shifting to grip the back of her chair, pinning her in place. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of the chemical reagents. For the first time, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was made of glass. "You knew the risk," he said, his voice a low vibration. "You knew that hitting a man in my position in front of those cameras could have ended your life before you even left the stage. Why didn't you just scream? Why the slap?" "Because a scream is just noise," Ayomide replied, her eyes locked onto his. "A slap is a disruption. I needed to break the moment. I needed to make sure you dropped that glass before a single drop touched your tongue. I chose the only weapon I had, your own pride." Hyun-Ro let out a short, dark laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He straightened up and turned to the technician. "Clear the room, and find out exactly who signed off on the security sweep for the West Wing tonight." As the man scrambled out, Hyun-Ro turned back to Ayomide. The fury was still there, but it was no longer aimed at her. "You saved my life, Ayomide Gabriel. But in doing so, you've trapped yourself in a war you weren't meant to fight. From this second on, you don't leave my sight. You are the only person in this building who isn't trying to bury me." The door to the holding room creaked open, but it wasn't the heavy, rhythmic tread of Hyun-Ro's boots that followed. Instead, the sharp, impatient click of stilettos sliced through the silence. Minna, the pristine fiance and the woman Ayomide had just seen plotting murder, stepped into the light. She looked radiant in her white silk engagement gown, the very image of a grieving, wronged bride, but her eyes held the predatory coldness of a viper. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, surveying Ayomide with a look of profound disgust, as if the waitress were a stain on her perfect evening. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a slim, gold-embossed checkbook, clicking an expensive fountain pen with a methodical snap. "You've caused a great deal of trouble, Ayomide," Minna said, her voice a sugary mask with venom beneath. "The camera saw everything. My fiancé is humiliated. The board is in an uproar, and you are a nameless girl who will disappear into foundations of a new skyscraper if you don't play this correctly." Ayomide leaned back, her pulse steadying. The fear was still there, but was being rapidly replaced by a cold, sharpening clarity. "I think the trouble started long before I stepped on that stage. Minna, it started when you decided a wedding was too much work and a funeral was more profitable." Minna's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, the nib of her pen hovering over the paper. The mask didn't break, but it tightened. "I don't know what delusions you think you heard, but in this world, the truth is whatever the person with the most power says it is." She scribbled a number on the check and tore it off, sliding the paper across the table. The amount was staggering. More money than Ayomide would see in 3 lifetimes of service. "Take it," Minna whispered, leaning in close enough for Ayomide to smell the expensive lilies on her skin. "Hyun-Ro will be back in 10 minutes. When he asks you why you did it, you will tell him it was a jealous obsession. You'll say you've been stalking him, that you wanted to ruin his special night, because you couldn't have him. You'll play the part of the crazy, scorned woman, and tomorrow, you'll be on a first-class flight back to the States with a bank account that never runs dry." Ayomide looked at the check, then up at the woman, who was effectively signing her own death warrant. "And if I don't? If I tell him the truth about the champagne, about Park, about the neurotoxin?" Minna laughed, a soft, musical sound that sent a chill down Ayomide's spine. "Do you really think he'll believe a waitress over the woman he's pledged to marry? Over the head of security, who has bled for his family? You aren't a savior, Ayomide. You're a temporary glitch in the system. Take the money and live. Stay silent and, well, Hyun-Ro has very creative ways of disposing of trash." Ayomide picked up the check, her fingers brushing Minna's. For a moment, Minna's eyes sparkled with triumph, thinking she about the silence she needed. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Ayomide tore the paper in half, then in quarters. She let the scraps flutter onto the table like snow. "I've spent my life being invisible," Ayomide said, her voice low and dangerous. "But tonight, I'm the only thing standing between you and the throne you didn't earn. Keep your money. You're going to need it for your legal fees." Minna's face contorted, the refined beauty twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She raised her hand as if to strike, but the door behind her heavy stepped open. Hyun-Ro stood in the threshold, his dark eyes taking the torn paper on the table and the trembling fury in his fiance's posture. "Mena," he said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "I don't recall giving you permission to enter this room." Mena's composure shattered, her face draining of color as she scrambled to adjust her mask of innocence. She let out a small, forced gasp, her hand flying to her chest. "Hyun-Ro, darling, I was only trying to understand why this person would do such a thing to us." She's clearly disturbed. Hyun-Ro didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Ayomide, and more specifically, the shredded fragment of the check scattered across the table. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with the realization that the woman he was supposed to marry had just tried to buy the silence of his savior. "Get out," Hyun-Ro said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of restrained violence. But Hyun-Ro... "Now," he barked, and Mena flinched, retreating toward the door with one final, murderous glare directed at Ayomide. As the door clicked shut, Hyun-Ro turned to the shadow, waiting in the hallway. It wasn't Park, his head of security. It was a younger man, one Ayomide hadn't seen before, with eyes like flint. "Prepare the armored SUV," Hyun-Ro commanded. "We aren't going back to the penthouse. We're going to the mountain estate, and I want a total blackout. No phones, no external comms, and no one from the primary security detail is to know the coordinates." Before Ayomide could protest, she was being ushered out of the room. The journey through the service tunnels of the gala hall was a blur of concrete and flickering lights. She was placed in the back of a vehicle that felt more like a tank than a car, the doors closing with pressurizers that signaled she was now in a world completely separate from the one she knew. Hyun-Ro sat beside her, his body a rigid line of tension. He didn't speak as the city lights of Seoul began to fade, replaced by the winding, dark roads leading into forested hills. When they finally pulled through the massive iron gates of his private estate, Ayomide realized why he called it a sanctuary. The house was a fortress of glass and black stone, perched on a cliffside that overlooked the valley like a gargoyle. "This is your home now," Hyun-Ro said as they stepped into the echoing marble foyer. "At least until I can figure out how deep the rock goes." Ayomide looked around at the minimalist luxury, the soaring ceilings and the silent, robotic efficiency of the few staff members present. It was beautiful, but it felt like a tomb. "You're locking me away," she realized, her voice echoing. "I'm not a witness anymore. I'm a prisoner." Hyun-Ro stopped and turned to her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You're the only person who knows the faces of the people who tried to kill me tonight. Outside these walls, you are a target. Inside, you are under my protection." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the space between them. "I don't trust the police. I don't trust my board. And as of 20 minutes ago, I don't trust my own family. My staff at the penthouse reported directly to Park. My fiance has access to all my accounts." He reached out, his fingers trailing lightly over the silk of her dress, a gesture that was both a threat and a promise. "In this house, the only law is mine. You wanted to save my life. Ayomide, this is a price. You've entered the lion's den, and the door is locked from the inside." Ayomide looked into his dark, searching eyes and felt the weight of the golden cage settling around her. She had saved the king, but in doing so, she had become his most dangerous secret. The first rays of dawn crept over the jagged mountain peaks, but inside the estate's high-tech command center, the atmosphere remained shrouded in darkness. Ayomide stood by the mahogany desk, still wearing the black dress in the gala, though it was now wrinkled and cold against her skin. Hyun-Ro sat before a wall of monitors, his fingers flying across a keyboard with precision that bordered on obsession. "If the system worked as intended," Hyun-Ro muttered, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep, "we would have high-definition footage of Mena and Park in the West Wing. Their faces, their voices, everything I need to end this quietly." He pulled up the directory for the grand ballroom security server. Ayomide leaned in, her breath hitching as the file list appeared. But as Hyun-Ro clicked on the timestamp for 10 p.m., the exact moment she had overhears the plot, a flickering file not found error splashed across the screen in brutal, mocking red. Hyun-Ro's jaw tightened. He tried the backup servers, then the cloud redundancy. Every single one returned the same result. A clean wipe. "It's gone," Ayomide whispered, the weight of their isolation feeling heavier. They didn't just kill the feed, they scrubbed the metadata. They knew you'd come looking. Hyun-Ro slammed his fist onto the desk, the monitors rattling. This wasn't just a security breach. To wipe the off-site backups, someone had to use my personal administrative override codes. Codes only 3 people in this world possess. Myself, my legal advisor, and... He trailed off, his eyes darkening as the realization hit him. And your head of security, Ayomide finished for him. Hyun-Ro stood up, pacing the room like a predator, realizing the bars of his cage were moving. Park didn't just help Minna. He orchestrated the digital cover-up. He's been my shadow for 2 decades, Ayomide. He knows every blind spot in my empire. If the footage is gone, it means the official story is already being written by them. To the world, I'm a paranoid boss who kidnapped a waitress, and you're the woman who assaulted me. He turned to a secondary terminal, pulling up a live news feed. His face was everywhere. The headline scrolled across the bottom. Mafia heir abducts waitress after public assault. Family pleads for her safe return. They're turning the public against us, Ayomide said, a chill running down her spine. By the time you prove there was poison, they'll have convinced everyone you've lost your mind. Hyun-Ro walked over to her, his presence intense and grounding. He placed a hand on the wall behind her, pinning her with a gaze that was no longer cold, but fiercely protective. They think they've erased the evidence, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. But they forgot one thing. They left a witness alive. As long as you are breathing, their official story is a lie. They didn't just wipe the tapes. They started a war they can't win. Ayomide looked at the screens, the red error messages still glowing like embers. The digital proof was dead, but the look in Hyun-Ro's eyes told her that the real investigation was only just beginning. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only piece of evidence left on the board. The silence in the command center grew heavy, thick with the tension of a man watching his empire crumble into digital dust. Hyun-Ro remained staring at the empty file directories, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Ayomide watched him, the weight of the information she had been holding back pressing against her chest like a physical burden. It wasn't just about the champagne anymore. The conspiracy she had overheard in that hallway was deeper and much older than a single night of poisoned celebration. Hyun-Ro, she said softly, her voice steady despite the shadows dancing on the walls. There's more. Something I didn't tell you in the interrogation room. He turned slowly, his dark eyes searching hers. The cold fury was still there, but beneath it was a raw, jagged edge of exhaustion. What else could there be? They tried to kill me. They wiped the servers, and they branded me a madman. What more could they have said? Ayomide stepped closer, moving into the soft glow of the monitors. When I was behind that curtain, I didn't just hear them talk about the neurotoxin. Park, he mentioned your father. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Hyun-Ro's entire posture changed, his body recoiling as if she had struck him. His father's death 3 years ago had been ruled a tragic accident, a brake failure on a mountain road, but it was a wound that had never truly healed. It was the event that had forced Hyun-Ro into the seat of power long before he was ready. What did he say? Hyun-Ro's voice was barely a whisper, a low, dangerous vibration. Park told Minna that the brakes worked the first time, and the poison will work the second. Ayomide revealed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He said he's been waiting 3 years to finish what he started. He told her that your father was too stubborn to die, but that you were too arrogant to see the snake at your own table. Hyun-Ro staggered back, his hand catching the edge of the desk to steady himself. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The loyalty he had trusted, the man who had stood by him at his father's funeral, was the very architect of his father's murder. The betrayal wasn't a sudden coup. It was a long-game execution that had been rotting his family from the inside out for years. He killed him, Hyun-Ro breathed, his eyes wide with a mix of agony and murderous clarity. My father didn't lose control of that car. Park took him from me. He looked at Ayomide, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying Mafia boss disappeared, replaced by a man drowning in the truth. Then, the mask slammed back into place, harder and colder than before. The dark secret was out, and it had transformed his desire for survival into a thirst for absolute vengeance. They didn't just try to take my life tonight, Hyun-Ro said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm register. They've been living on the blood of my family for 3 years. He reached out, his hand wrapping around Ayomide's arm. Not to restrain her, but as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. You aren't just a witness to a murder plot anymore, Ayomide. You are the key to a 3-year-old execution. And I promise you, by the time this is over, they will wish the poison had worked on me. The morning sun filtered through the reinforced glass of the estate, but the digital world outside was already in a state of absolute frenzy. The video of the slap had reached millions of views, and the narrative being spun by Minna, and the board was on a violent, obsessed woman and a victimized Mafia heir. Hyun-Ro sat at the head of the conference table, his eyes fixed on a tablet as his new, vetted PR team waited for his command. He knew that to win this war, he had to take the weapon of public opinion away from his enemies. Do it, Hyun-Ro commanded, his voice a low, decisive rumble. Minutes later, a formal video statement was released across all major news networks and social media platforms. In the video, Hyun-Ro stood in front of the syndicate's crest, looking composed, powerful, and entirely in control. He didn't look like a man who had been humiliated. He looked like a strategist who had just completed a successful operation. The events at last night's engagement party were not an assault. Hyun-Ro stated to the camera, his gaze piercing. They were a security drill. Miss Ayomide Gabriel is a highly specialized safety consultant under my personal employ. The slap was a prearranged physical signal to alert me to a security breach that my primary team had failed to detect. Her intervention prevented a potential catastrophe. I owe her my life, and any further harassment or defamation directed toward her will be treated as an attack on the Baek family itself. Ayomide watched the broadcast from the doorway, her heart skipping a beat. By claiming she was part of his inner circle, he hadn't just cleared her name. He had shielded her with his own formidable reputation. He had effectively neutralized Minna's attempt to paint her as a crazy waitress, turning her into a hero in the eyes of the public. Hyun-Ro turned off the screen and looked at her. The silence that followed was charged with a new kind of intensity. The world now sees you as my protector, he said, walking toward her until the heat from his body was palpable. The media will stop hunting you as a criminal, but the snakes inside my house, they will see this for what it is, a declaration of war. By protecting your reputation, I've made you the most dangerous person in their world. Ayomide looked at him, realizing the weight of the gamble he had just taken. He had tied his public image to hers, staking his credibility on a woman he had only known for a few hours. You've made me your partner in their eyes, she whispered. No, Hyun-Ro corrected, his hand coming up to rest on the doorframe beside her head, pinning her with his shadow. I've made you untouchable. Minna and Park can no longer eliminate you without proving to the world that I am a liar. You are now the living evidence they can't touch, and the only witness they can't silence. We've changed the narrative, Ayomide. Now we change the ending. The tension between them thrummed, a mix of newfound trust and the looming threat of the dark secret they now shared. The public apology had bought them time, but as the news cycle shifted, Ayomide knew the real battle was moving from the cameras to the shadows of the estate. The serenity of the mountain estate was shattered at precisely 3 a.m. It wasn't the sound of gunfire that woke Ayomide, but the sudden, oppressive silence as the house's secondary power grid was cut. The soft hum of the climate control died, leaving only the sound of her own frantic breathing in the pitch-black room. Before she could reach for the lamp, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. She surged upward in a panic, her elbow striking something hard, until a familiar, low voice hissed into her ear. It's me. Stay silent if you want to live. Hyun-Ro's presence was a jagged silhouette in the moonlight. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was in a tactical black shirt, a handgun gripped firmly in his free hand. He pulled her from the bed, his movement fluid and urgent. The perimeter sensors were bypassed using internal codes, he whispered, his chest heaving. Park sent the professionals. They aren't here to talk. A muffled thud vibrated through floorboards, the sound of a door being breached downstairs. Ayomide felt a cold dread settle in her gut. How many? Too many for us to hold the house, Hyun-Ro replied, guiding her toward a hidden panel in the dressing room wall. We need to reach the garage in the sublevel. As they slipped into the narrow service corridor behind the walls, the house erupted. Muffled pops of suppressed weapons echoed through the vents. Ayomide followed close behind Hyun-Ro, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. He moved with a lethal grace, checking every corner with a calculated intensity that reminded her exactly who he was. They reached the stairwell just as a shadow emerged from the floor below, a red laser that danced across Hyun-Ro's chest. Without hesitation, Ayomide grabbed a heavy bronze bust from a decorative alcove and hurled it with every ounce of her strength. The heavy metal object caught the assassin in the shoulder just as he fired, sending the bullet into the ceiling. Hyun-Ro didn't miss his opening. He fired twice, the suppressed round sounding like heavy coughs in the narrow space. The intruder slumped, and Hyun-Ro pulled Ayomide down the stairs, his grip on her hand bruisingly tight. "Nice throw," he grunted, the first hint of adrenaline-fueled respect in his voice. "I didn't save you at the gala just to let you die in your pajamas," she whispered back, her heart hammering. They reached the sublevel garage, where the air smelled of gasoline and cold concrete. Hyun-Ro's armored SUV sat waiting, but 3 men in tactical gear were already closing in on it. Hyun-Ro shoved Ayomide behind a concrete pillar. "When I start firing, run for the driver's side. Don't look back. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Now go." He stepped into the open, a one-man vanguard of fury, his weapon spitting fire to provide cover. Ayomide sprinted, her feet slapping against the concrete. Bullets pinged off the pillar behind her, spraying stone chips into the air. She reached the door, scrambled inside, and hit the ignition. The engine roared to life just as Hyun-Ro dived into the passenger seat, blood trailing from a graze on his temple. "Drive!" He roared as the garage door began to grind upward. Ayomide slammed the vehicle into gear, flooring it. They burst through the rising door and into the freezing mountain night, the SUV's tires screaming as they tore down the winding driveway, leaving the burning sanctuary behind. In the rear-view mirror, Ayomide saw the flash of muzzle flares, but she didn't slow down. She had entered the lion's den, and now the lions were hunting together. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape began to ebb, replaced by a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion as Ayomide steered the SUV into shadows of nondescript shipping container yard on the outskirts of Incheon. The safe house was a far cry from the marble-clad estate. It was a cramped, industrial loft hidden behind a false wall in a defunct textile warehouse. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old machinery, lit only by a single amber bulb that hummed with low, nervous energy. Hyun-Ro sat on the edge of a crate, his face pale under the harsh light. The graze on his temple had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, jagged crust against his skin. As Ayomide approached with basic first aid kit she'd found in the kitchenette, he didn't pull away. He remained still, his eyes tracking her movements with strange, quiet intensity. "You're surprisingly good at this," he murmured, his voice raspy as she dabbed an antiseptic cloth against the wound. "Driving like a getaway pilot, throwing bronze statues at assassins. Most people in your position would have stayed in the car and hoped for the best." Ayomide offered a tired, fleeting smile. "I grew up in a neighborhood where you didn't look for trouble, but you learn how to move when trouble looked for you. My father used to say that fear is a luxury we couldn't afford. You either use it or it uses you." She paused, her fingers lingering near his temple. "What about you? You were born into this. Did you ever have a choice?" Hyun-Ro looked away, his gaze falling to his hands. Strong, scarred hands that were now stained with the dust of his own crumbling empire. "My father wanted me to be a lawyer. He thought he could legitimize the family name through me. But the night he died, the night of that accident, I realized that the law only protects those who aren't being hunted from within. I stepped into his shoes to find his killers. I just didn't realize I was inviting them to sit at my table. For a moment, the distance between them, the gap between the Mafia boss and the waitress, vanished. They were simply two people caught in a storm of other people's making." Ayomide sat beside him, the cold metal of the crate biting through her dress. We're more alike than I thought, she whispered. Both of us are just trying to survive the secrets our fathers left behind. Hyun-Ro turned back to her, and the air between them shifted. The predatory coldness that usually defined him had softened into something raw and magnetic. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. I came to that party tonight, expecting to secure my future with a marriage contract. I didn't expect to find my life in the hands of a woman who has every reason to hate me. Ayomide didn't pull back. The danger outside the warehouse felt miles away, eclipsed by the heat of his touch. I don't hate you, Hyun-Ro. I just hate the world you live in. Then let me show you a different one, he whispered, his face inching closer until their foreheads touched. In the dim, flickering light of the warehouse, the spark that had begun with slap ignited into something deeper, a silent, desperate pact between two allies who had found home in the heart of a war. The fragile piece of the warehouse was broken as the reality of their situation surged back in. Hyun-Ro paced the length of the industrial floor, his mind working like a chess grandmaster's, while Ayomide watched him, her heart still racing from the closeness they had shared. They knew the public apology was only a temporary shield. Park and Minna would eventually realize they were hiding together, and then they would stop at nothing to finish the job. The digital evidence is gone, and my testimony alone isn't enough to sway the syndicate council, Hyun-Ro said, his voice returning to its sharp, professional edge. They need to see the betrayal for themselves. They need a confession. And how do we get that? Ayomide asked, stepping toward him. They think I'm under your protection. They won't say a word if you're in the room. Hyun-Ro stopped and turned to her, a dark, dangerous light in his eyes. They think you're under my protection, but they also know you're an outsider, a waitress who suddenly found herself in a nest of vipers. They'll believe you're scared. They'll believe you're looking for a way out. He laid a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. We're going to give them exactly what they want. We're going to let Park think you've turned on me. You're going to contact him and offer to sell the truth. You'll tell him you have a recording of my father's murder, the real secret, and that you'll hand it over for enough money to disappear forever. Ayomide felt a cold shiver run down her spine. You want me to walk right into their hands? After they just tried to burn down your estate with us inside? It's the only way to lure them into the open, Hyun-Ro insisted, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. They're desperate. If they think there's a recording out there that proves the break failure wasn't an accident, they won't send assassins. They'll come themselves to make sure the evidence is destroyed. And where would I meet them? She asked, her resolve beginning to harden. She had already slapped a Mafia boss and escaped a burning fortress. She wasn't about to stop now. The Lotte World Tower, Hyun-Ro replied. The highest point in the city. It's public enough to make them feel safe, but private enough for a transaction on the skywalk. My team will be in the shadows, wired into the cameras. I'll be listening to every breath you take. He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip, his gaze intense and almost pleading. I am asking you to play the most dangerous role of your life. Ayomide. If this fails, I won't be able to reach you in time. Ayomide looked at the man who had gone from her captor to her only hope. She thought about the poisoned champagne and the secret of his father's death. She thought about the way he had held her in the dark. I'll do it, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. But I'm not just playing a role, Hyun-Ro. I'm finishing what I started. We're bringing them down. Hyun-Ro didn't smile, but the respect in his eyes was worth more than any check Minna could have written. He pulled a small, high-tech recording device from his pocket and pressed it into her palm. Then let's set the trap. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of the Lotte World Tower, a relentless, ghostly shriek that seemed to mock the fragile safety of the observation deck. Ayomide stood alone near the edge of the glass skywalk, 500 meters above the glittering, indifferent lights of Seoul. Beneath her feet, the city looked like a circuit board, cold and distant. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a heavy trench coat, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, metallic casing of the recorder taped to her ribs. Every second felt like an hour. Hyun-Ro's voice was a faint, grounding crackle in the tiny earpiece hidden beneath her curls. Stay calm, Ayomide. I can hear your heart racing through the mic. Breathe. My team is 3 floors down, moving through the maintenance shafts. You're not alone. I don't feel not alone, she whispered into her collar, her breath fogging in the frigid night air. The heavy glass doors at the far end of the deck slid open with a pressurized hiss. Park, the head of security, stepped out. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear or a professional suit. He was dressed in a casual overcoat, looking like any other businessman, but his eyes were the same flinty, murderous voids Ayomide remembered from the gala. He stopped 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty, but his posture radiating a predatory readiness. "You've got a lot of nerve, girl," Park said, his voice easily carrying over the wind. "Most people would have kept running until they hit the ocean. Instead, you call me to talk business." "Running is expensive," Ayomide countered, forcing her voice to remain steady, just as Hyun-Ro had coached her. "And Baek Hyun-Ro is a paranoid man. He's already looking at me like a liability. I want out of Korea, and I want enough money to make sure I'm never found." Park took a step closer, his gaze sweeping the empty deck for signs of an ambush. "And you claim to have a recording? Something from a night the old chairman died." "I found in a hidden partition in the penthouse safe while Hyun-Ro was distracted," she lied, the script flowing from her lips with a desperate conviction. "It's a dashcam audio file. It captures the moment the brakes were cut, and it captures your voice on the radio. Park, you didn't just kill the father, you bragged about it." Park's face didn't twitch, but his eyes darkened, a vein pulsing at his temple. If such a recording existed, Hyun-Ro would have used it to hang me years ago. "He never found it, but I did." Ayomide challenged, pulling a small, dummy flash drive from her pocket and holding it up between 2 fingers. "The truth for $5 million and a clean passport. That's the price for your freedom." The silence that followed was deafening. Park stared at the drive, his shadow stretching long across the glass floor. "You're a brave woman, Ayomide. Brave or incredibly stupid." He began to walk toward her, a slow, menacing crawl. "Show me it works. Play a snippet, and we can talk about your retirement." "Check your 6. Hyun-Ro's voice hissed in her ear, sharp and urgent. "He's not alone." Min-ah just exited the elevator. Ayomide's blood turned to ice as she heard the secondary click of heels on the glass behind her. The trap was set, but the snakes were closing in from both sides. The clicking of Min-ah's heels stopped, the sound sharp and final against the reinforced glass. Ayomide stood trapped between the 2 architects of Hyun-Ro's misery. Park's face, previously a mask of cautious greed, underwent a terrifying transformation. He didn't look at the flash drive anymore. He looked at the earpiece hidden by Ayomide's curls. His years of training hadn't failed him. He had caught the subtle tilt of her head, the way she seemed to be listening to a ghost. "The drive is empty, isn't it?" Park's voice was a low, lethal vibration. He took a step forward, his eyes darting to the shadows of the maintenance shafts. "You aren't here to sell a secret. You're the wire." "Park, just take the drive and let's go," Min-ah hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of impatience and growing dread. "We don't have time for her games." "There is no recording, Min-ah." Park roared, his composure snapping. He turned his predatory gaze back to Ayomide. "She's a lure, which means he's listening. He's here, isn't he? Somewhere in the dark, watching his little waitress play hero." Ayomide backed away, her heels skidding on the transparent floor. The city lights below seemed to swirl, a dizzying abyss waiting to swallow her. "He knows everything, Park. He knows about the brakes. He knows about the toxin. There's nowhere left for you to hide." "Then I'll give him something else to watch," Park snarled. He lunged forward with a speed that defied his age. Ayomide tried to dodge, but his hand clamped around her throat, slamming her back against the waist-high glass railing. The air left her lungs in a painful wheeze as her upper body tilted dangerously over the 500-meter drop. "Hyun-Ro!" She gasped into the hidden mic, her hands clawing at Park's iron grip. "I'm coming. Hold on." Hyun-Ro's voice exploded in her ear, frantic and raw with a fear she had never heard from him. The sound of a heavy door being kicked open echoed from the floor below, followed by the rapid-fire rhythm of boots on metal stairs. Park's face was inches from hers, his eyes bloodshot with desperate rage. If I'm going down, I'm taking his only witness with me. Let's see if he can catch you from this height. He braced his weight, lifting Ayomide's feet off the glass. Stop. Min-ah screamed, finally realizing the scale of the disaster. If she dies now, there's no cover-up. Park, stop. But Park was past the point of reason. He shoved Ayomide further over the edge, the cold night wind whipping her hair into a frenzy. Her fingers slipped against the cold glass, the railing biting into her spine. Below her, there was nothing but empty air and the distant, uncaring glow of the Seoul streets. Goodbye, Ayomide, Park whispered, his muscles tensing for the final shove. Just as her grip failed, a deafening crack shattered the tension. A bullet whined off the metal railing inches from Park's head, spraying sparks. Park flinched, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the window Ayomide needed. She twisted, driving her knee into his midsection and rolling back onto the solid glass of the skywalk. Gasping for air as a shadow of man burst through the emergency exit, weapon raised and eyes burning with the fires of hell. Hyun-Ro emerged from the stairwell, like a shadow manifested from the night itself. His movements were precise, his eyes fixed on Ayomide with a harrowing intensity that shifted into cold lethality the moment he looked at Park. He didn't wait for a confession or a plea. He moved with a speed that blurred in the strobe-like flashes of the tower's warning lights, closing the distance before Park could recover his footing. Get away from her, Hyun-Ro commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate to the very glass beneath them. Park lunged, reaching for a concealed weapon in his waistband, but Hyun-Ro was faster. He caught Park's wrist in a grip that sounded like snapping dry wood, twisting the larger man toward the edge of the skywalk. With a brutal efficiency, Hyun-Ro disarmed him and pinned him against the railing, the same railing where Ayomide had nearly met her end seconds before. You thought you could kill my father and then take his son? Hyun-Ro hissed, his face inches from the traitor's. You thought I was too arrogant to see you? No, Park. I was just waiting for you to prove it to the world. Min-ah stood frozen, her hands over her mouth as she realized the man she conspired with was being dismantled by the man she had intended to murder. Hyun-Ro, please, she sobbed. He forced me. He threatened me. Hyun-Ro didn't even look at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored tablet. It's too late for lies, Min-ah. The wire Ayomide is wearing isn't just feeding to my earpiece. It's been broadcasting a live encrypted stream to the entire Syndicate Council for the last 10 minutes. The color drained from Park's face. The Syndicate Council, the shadow board of elders who govern the Mafia's interests, valued loyalty above all else. To kill a boss was one thing, but to be caught plotting against the bloodline in such a pathetic, exposed manner was a death sentence. They heard everything, Ayomide said, her voice shaky but gaining strength as she stood beside Hyun-Ro. They heard you admit to the breaks. They heard you admit to the toxin. They heard you try to throw me off this building. On the screens across the observation deck, which usually showed tourist information, a series of windows began to pop up. The faces of the council elders appeared, their expressions grim and unforgiving. The dark secret was no longer a secret. It was a public execution of their reputations. Hyun-Ro pulled Ayomide toward him, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. He looked at the camera mounted on the wall, speaking directly to his peers. The rod has been excised. Park and Min-ah are no longer part of the Baek family. Deal with them according to the old laws. Black-clad enforcers, the true loyalists who have been waiting for the signal, swarmed the deck from the elevators. They seized Park and a screaming Min-ah, dragging him away into the night. Hyun-Ro turned to Ayomide, his hand reaching up to brush a stray curl from her face. The adrenaline was still there, but his touch was incredibly gentle. You did it, he whispered. You brought the truth into the light. Ayomide leaned into him, the cold wind of the tower finally feeling less like a threat and more like a fresh start. The Empire hadn't fallen. It had been reborn in the fires of her defiance. The sirens of the police and the Syndicate's private security faded into a distant hum as the Lotte World Tower was cleared of the chaos. The night air on the observation deck was finally still, though the scent of ozone and the weight of the dark secret lingered. Ayomide stood by the railing, her trench coat fluttering in the breeze. For the first time in days, the crushing pressure in her chest had eased. Park and Minna were gone, caught in the very web they had woven, and the truth of Hyun-Ro's father was finally etched into the records of the Syndicate Council. Hyun-Ro approached her slowly, his footsteps heavy but no longer predatory. He looked at the city below, the empire he had nearly lost, and the one he had now solidified through fire. He stopped a few inches from her, his presence no longer a cage, but a harbor. "The transport is waiting downstairs," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I've arranged for a private flight. To the States, to Europe, wherever you feel the most invisible. You'll have the funds, Minna, promise you, but without the blood on them. You can go back to being the woman you were before you walked into that gala." Ayomide looked out at the glittering lights of Seoul. "The woman I was before didn't know how to survive a night attack in the mountains. She didn't know how to stare down a killer on a glass bridge." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "I don't think that woman exists anymore, Hyun-Ro." Hyun-Ro's jaw tightened, a flash of something vulnerable crossing his usually stoic features. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. "Then don't go back to her." He stepped closer, closing the final gap between them, until she could feel the steady, rapid thrum of his heart. "I spent my life thinking everyone was a pawn or a threat. I thought the only way to rule was to be the coldest man in the room. Then you slapped me, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than duty." He took both of her hands in his grip firm and desperate. "I'm not asking you to stay as a witness. I don't need a protector or a secret keeper. I want a partner. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm heading for a cliff. Someone who sees the man, not just the boss." Ayomide looked at the man who had been her captor, her investigator, and ultimately her savior. The world he lived in was dangerous. It was a labyrinth of shadows and steel. But in his eyes, she saw a truth that no recording could capture. "It won't be easy," she whispered, her heart leaning into the choice. "Your world, it's not exactly a fairy tale." "No," Hyun-Ro agreed, a real, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. "It's a war, but I'd rather fight it with you than win it alone." Ayomide smiled back, reaching up to rest her hand against the jaw she had once struck in defiance. "Then I guess the flight is canceled." Hyun-Ro pulled her into a deep, thorough kiss as the sun began to peek over the Seoul skyline. The city below was still full of secrets and schemes, but up here on the edge of the sky, Ayomide Gabriel was no longer an outsider. She was home. If you love this story, make sure you're subscribed because I have so many more coming your way. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Ayomide and Hyun-Ro. Drop a comment telling me what you think happens next for them. Do they live happily ever after, or does the Mafia world pull them apart? Let me know your theories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.